It is some time after midnight, or close to it. The house has gone still in the particular way houses do at this hour, and the only thing still moving in the room is your mind. And it is not thinking about anything you chose. Have you noticed that? That the sentences arriving now are not ones you composed. That they turn up, finished, with no run-up, in a voice that is almost yours and not quite, saying things about you with more confidence than you have ever felt about anything. Almost everybody has this. Almost nobody says so out loud, because the only words we have been handed for it are medical ones, and nobody wants to reach for those about themselves at this hour. Tonight we sit with a man who had exactly that, at 38, in the middle of an entirely successful life. He was a physician. He knew precisely what it usually means. And he decided, because he could think of nothing better to do, to go down and meet it on purpose. His name was Carl Gustav Jung. What he did over the next 6 years, and the strange and beautiful object he made out of it, is where we are going tonight. Chapter 1. The thought that arrives when nobody is supervising. Begin, as always, with the reason you might be listening at this hour. There is a particular thing minds do late at night that they do not do during the day, and it has nothing to do with worry. Worry is ordinary. Worry has content and a shape and a subject you could name if somebody asked. This is different. This is the moment when a sentence arrives in your head that you did not compose. It might be a memory you had no intention of retrieving, arriving whole, in detail, from 30 years ago. It might be a phrase that repeats. It might be a scene playing itself out that you are not directing. It might be a voice that is recognizably not the voice you think in, saying something about you with more confidence than you have ever felt about anything. During the day, this does not happen, or you do not notice it. During the day, there is a queue of things asking for your attention, and your mind is busy answering them. At 1 a.m, the queue is empty. And into that empty room, something comes in that appears to have its own opinions. Almost everybody has had this. Almost nobody says so, because the available vocabulary for it is medical, and nobody wants to reach for medical vocabulary about themselves at 1 a.m. There is a detail worth noticing, and it is the detail this whole evening turns on. The unnerving part is not the content. Whatever your mind produces at that hour, you have probably thought worse things deliberately. The unnerving part is the authorship. Something appeared, and you did not make it, and it is happening inside the place where you live. And the ordinary way of understanding yourself, which is that you are the one in here doing the thinking, does not have a slot for that. So a small alarm goes off. Not about the thought, about the arrangement. There is a further detail, and it is the one that makes this hour distinctive rather than merely unpleasant. The material that arrives is not new. Nothing turns up at 1 a.m. that you did not already possess. The memory was already stored. The sentence about yourself was already available. The conclusion about the person who did that to you in 1998 was already sitting there in the drawer. What has changed is only the retrieval conditions. And that is why arguing with it does not work, and why the arrival feels so much like revelation. It is not new information being delivered. It is old information being handed to you by a part of your mind that is not currently being supervised, in a room where nothing is contradicting it. The daytime version of you is not braver or more rational. The daytime version of you simply has other traffic. I want to plant something here that we will come back to a long way down the line, because tonight has one practical finding at the end of it, and I would rather it did not arrive out of nowhere. There is a way of going over things that helps, and a way that grinds, and the difference between them is not how long you do it or how painful the subject is. It is one small structural feature of the thinking itself, and it can be switched, and it has been measured under controlled conditions. We will get there. For now, only notice this. Whatever arrives tonight, you are not receiving it. You are producing it in a room with the lid off. Chapter 2. Thinking, being thought at, and why it is worse at this hour. Try the distinction carefully, because it will matter later. When you think something, there is an effort attached. You can feel the small work of it. You could stop. You chose the direction, and you can change it, and if somebody interrupted you, you would lose your place. When you are thought at, none of that is true. It arrives, finished. There was no run-up. You could not have predicted the next word. And you cannot stop it by deciding to, which is the part that frightens people, because deciding to is the only tool most of us have ever been issued. Now, here is the thing that ought to be more widely known. The second one is not rare, and it is not a malfunction, and you have been doing it your entire life without alarm. Every dream you have ever had was written by something that is not the part of you that decides. You did not plan the dream. You did not know what was coming. People in it said things you would not have said, and did things you did not expect. And you believed the whole production while it was running. Nobody finds that pathological, because it happens on the other side of a door marked sleep, and the door makes it acceptable. What happened to Jung in 1913, and what happens to you at 1 a.m, is the same machinery operating with the door open. 3 ordinary things are true at 1 a.m. that are not true at 11 a.m, and between them they explain almost all of it. The first is that there is no external traffic. All day your attention is being pulled outward by things that genuinely require it. That pull is also, incidentally, a lid. Remove the traffic, and the lid goes with it. The second is that the part of you that evaluates has gone off shift before the part that generates. The mind that produces images and associations is perfectly happy at 1 a.m. The mind that says, "Hold on, that is not a reasonable inference," is tired. So the production line runs unsupervised, and the quality control desk is empty. The third is that you are horizontal, in the dark, in silence, with your eyes closed, which is the closest a waking person gets to sensory deprivation. Put anyone in that condition for long enough, and their mind will begin supplying material, because that is what it does when nothing is coming in. This has been demonstrated many times, deliberately, in laboratories, on ordinary volunteers, with nothing wrong with them. So at 1 in the morning, you have an unsupervised generator, an empty room, and no incoming signal. Under those three conditions, the mind produces. That is not a symptom. That is the equipment working as designed in the conditions it was never designed for. There is a fourth condition, less often mentioned, and for a lot of people it is the decisive one. You are not moving. During the day, whenever something unpleasant arrives, you do something with your body without noticing that you have. You stand up, you go to the kettle, you change rooms, you pick something up. Every one of those is a small interruption, and the cumulative effect of a few hundred of them is that no single train of thought gets a clear run at you. Lying still in the dark, that entire apparatus is switched off. There is nowhere to go and nothing to pick up, and the only thing available to move is the thought itself. Which is why the advice to get up, if it has been more than 20 minutes, is not merely about sleep hygiene. It is about interrupting a process that requires stillness to continue. And there is one more feature of this hour that is worth naming, because it is the source of a great deal of unnecessary self-reproach. Things decided at 1 in the morning are almost always decided wrongly, and this is not a moral failing. Fatigue narrows the range of options a mind can hold at once. Distress biases the sample of evidence it retrieves. Darkness removes the corrective signal of other people's faces. And the absence of anything to do next means every conclusion arrives fully general, because there is no specific action available to make it concrete. So the conclusions that arrive now are systematically more extreme, more total, and more about your character than the ones that arrive at 11 with a cup of something in your hand. You have noticed this. Everybody has. And almost nobody treats it as a reason to distrust the verdict, because the verdict does not feel like an opinion produced under poor conditions. It feels like the truth finally getting through. It is not. It is the same equipment, running on less, in a room with no windows. Chapter 3. What this evening is and what it is not. Before we go into the story, 2 pieces of housekeeping, because this topic is surrounded by more nonsense than almost any other in the history of psychology, and I would rather be boring and accurate than exciting and wrong. The first concerns the sources. Most of what people know about this period comes from a book called Memories, Dreams, Reflections, published in 1962, the year after Jung died. It is usually described as his autobiography. It is not exactly that. It was assembled by his colleague Aniela Jaffe from conversations over several years. Some chapters he wrote himself, others she wrote from what he said, and he revised them. Some material was cut by the family before publication. Scholars have been careful about it for decades, and so should we. So when I tell you that he said something, what I usually mean is that this is what appears in a book put together in his old age by somebody else about events that were 40 and 50 years behind him. That is not a reason to discard it. It is a reason to hold it loosely. The second concerns the Red Book itself, and it is the thing that almost every retelling gets wrong. The Red Book is not a diary. He did not write in it as things happened. What happened as things happened was a set of small, black-bound notebooks which he kept from 1913 onwards and which were not published until 2020. Those are the raw record. They are messy, and they are dated, and they are the actual thing. The Red Book is what he made afterwards. Beginning around 1915, he took the material from the black notebooks and rewrote it, in a deliberately archaic and elevated style. In a large red leather folio, in careful medieval calligraphy, adding a running commentary on his own experiences and painting illuminations around the text. In other words, it is a composed literary work about the experience, made by a man who had already had it and was trying to shape it into something. That distinction matters enormously, and we will come back to it, because it turns out to be the entire mechanism. A third thing, which is less housekeeping and more of a promise about the shape of the evening. I am going to keep separating two questions that almost every account of this material runs together. The first is, what happened to this man? That is a question about 1913 and about a person who has been dead since 1961. And it is interesting the way any strange and well-documented episode is interesting. The second is, what does his case tell us about ordinary minds, including yours, tonight? And that question is only answerable by leaving him and going to the research, because one anecdote about one unusual man is not evidence about anything. You will notice the joins. I will say when we are in the story and when we are in the evidence, and I will say when the evidence is thin. There is a reason for that, beyond pedantry. This subject attracts a particular kind of writing in which a strange event is described beautifully and then quietly used as proof of a general claim, and the reader is carried across the gap by the quality of the prose. That is a conjuring trick, and it is very effective at 1 a.m, when the part of you that checks has gone off shift. So, story, then evidence, and a visible seam between them. The story is remarkable enough that it does not need help, and the evidence is better than you would expect. Let your shoulders drop for a moment before we start, and let the weight of your body settle into whatever is holding it. There is nothing in the next 3 hours that asks anything of you. If your attention wanders off and comes back somewhere in the middle, that is fine, and it is what this is for. Nothing later depends on your having followed the earlier part. Chapter 4. What his life looked like from outside in 1912. It is worth being specific about how much this man had to lose, because it changes what the next 6 years mean. He was 37. He had trained at Basel and then spent 9 years at the Burg Holzli, the psychiatric hospital in Zurich, which was one of the most serious institutions of its kind in Europe. He had done the word association work that made his name, which was a genuinely elegant piece of experimental psychology and is still cited. He was a lecturer at the University of Zurich. He was the first president of the International Psychoanalytical Association. He had been to America and been received as somebody important. He had a private practice with more demand than he could meet, and a great deal of that demand came from wealthy foreigners. He had built a large house at Kusnacht on the lake in 1908 to his own specification, with his consulting room in it. He had a wife, Emma, who was intelligent, formidable, and independently wealthy. They had 5 children. By any measure available in 1912, he had arrived. And the thing that is easy to miss from this distance is that a man in that position has an enormous amount of machinery invested in being the person who explains other people's minds. It is not merely his income. It is the entire architecture of who he is, which is the specific reason why what happened next was as frightening as it was. It is one thing to be 22 and unsure whether your mind is reliable. It is another to be 38 in a house you built with a practice full of patients who are relying on your judgment about exactly this, and to find that you cannot vouch for your own. It is also worth knowing what kind of scientist he had been up to that point, because the popular picture of Jung as a mystic is a picture of the second half of his life, and it is not what the record shows for the first. At the Bergholzli he had run what were, for the period, genuinely careful experiments. The work he is best known for from those years is the word association test. The procedure was mechanical. You read a subject a list of words, one at a time, and you record what word they answer with and, crucially, how long they take, measured with a stopwatch. What he established with numbers is that the delays are not random, they cluster. A subject will answer instantly to 40 words, and then hesitate, or repeat the stimulus word, or laugh, or fail to answer at all, and the words that produce those disturbances turn out to be connected to each other by a theme the subject is not thinking about and often does not want to discuss. He called those clusters complexes, and the word entered the language from that laboratory. Now notice what the experiment actually demonstrates, because it is the foundation of everything he did afterwards. It demonstrates from the outside, with a stopwatch, that there is something in a person that has its own preferences and its own reaction times, and that the person is not aware of it, and that it interferes with what they are consciously trying to do. He had spent years proving that experimentally on other people before it ever happened to him, which means that when the flood arrived in 1913, he was not a man encountering a strange idea for the first time. He was a man who had measured the thing with a stopwatch in a laboratory on volunteers, and who now had it in his own head at full volume. There is a version of that in ordinary life, which is more common than you would think. Knowing exactly how something works is almost no protection against it happening to you. Doctors get ill and are frightened. People who understand anxiety perfectly have it anyway. The knowledge and the experience are stored in different places, and the first one does not reach the second one at 1 in the morning. Chapter 5. The break and the question he could not answer. We are going to do the Freud rupture in one chapter, deliberately, because it is a whole story of its own, and it is not tonight's story. Tonight begins the morning after it. Briefly then. From 1907 to 1912, Jung was Freud's closest and most important ally, and Freud regarded him as the successor. The correspondence between them is enormous and, for a while, genuinely warm. It came apart over an idea. Freud held that the fundamental energy of the psyche was sexual. Jung, in a book published in 1912, redefined it as something broader and also began taking religious and mythological material seriously in a way that Freud regarded as a retreat into mysticism. There was also the ordinary human material underneath it. A younger man who did not want a father, and an older man who did not want a rival. The correspondence ended in 1913. Jung resigned the presidency of the association in 1914. He also gave up his university lectureship, and that is the situation he was in when the flood arrived. He had just detached himself from the only intellectual structure that had ever held his work, at the same time as detaching himself from the institution that gave him professional standing. In the same year that his own mind began producing things he could not account for. Those three facts are not a coincidence, and he never claimed they were. There is a small moment from this period that is more revealing than any of the visions, and it is the one I would keep if I could keep only one. He had been in the habit of asking his patients, as a matter of routine, about the story they were living inside. What did they believe? What myth were they operating on? It was a standard part of how he worked. And at some point in 1912 or 1913, he turned the question around on himself and found that he had no answer. He put it to himself very simply. He was treating people by helping them find their own myth. So, what was his? And he did not know. He had a science. He had a method. He had a professional identity of considerable weight. But when he asked what story he was actually living inside, there was nothing there. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not a rare condition and it does not require a crisis to produce it. A great many people arrive somewhere around their late 30s or their 40s or their 50s, having done everything correctly, in possession of a functioning life, and discover that they cannot say what it is for in any terms that convince them. Not despair, not depression necessarily, just a missing answer where an answer used to be assumed. Jung's response to finding that gap is the whole of what follows. He did not go looking for a philosophy. He did not read his way out of it. He decided that the answer, if it existed, was somewhere underneath him, and that the only way to find out was to go and look. It is worth adding what this did to his relationship with his own profession, because it is the part with the sharpest edge, and it is usually skipped. He had spent a decade proving, with instruments, that the mind contains material its owner cannot access and cannot control. And when it happened to him, the discipline he had helped build had nothing to offer. There was no treatment. There was no colleague he could go to who would not have been professionally obliged to think less of him. The one man who might have understood was the man he had just broken with, and going back was impossible for reasons that were half intellectual and half pride. So the founder of a field about the unconscious had a crisis of the unconscious and was completely unattended. I raise it because there is a common and painful version of this that has nothing to do with psychiatry. A great many people are, professionally, the person who handles the thing, the doctor, the manager everybody brings problems to, the one in the family who organizes, the person whose competence at a particular kind of difficulty is the load-bearing fact of their identity. And when that exact difficulty arrives in their own life, they are the worst-placed person in the room to ask for help, because asking would cost them the thing their standing rests on. That is not vanity. It is a real structural trap, and the people in it are frequently the last to be reached. If you recognize it, the useful sentence is not that you should be braver. It is that the competence and the crisis are separate items, and that the first does not disqualify you from the second, and that the person you would immediately help if they came to you with this is not a lesser person for coming. Chapter 6. The stones on the lake shore. And the first thing he did, having decided that, was so undignified that he was still slightly embarrassed about it 50 years later. He could not think of anything. That is the honest starting point. A man who has spent his adult life devising methods for other people sat down to devise one for himself and came up empty. So he did the only thing he could think of, which was to ask when the last time was that he had done anything spontaneously without a purpose. The answer was when he was 11 years old, and it was building. So, at 38, an internationally known physician began going down to the shore of the lake after lunch every day in front of his own house to gather stones from the water's edge and build with them. Not a metaphor. Actual stones, in his hands, in the mud, every day for months. He built a village. It acquired a castle. The castle needed a church, and he found himself unable to place the altar. And while working out where the altar went, he found a red stone in the shallows that had been shaped by the water into a pyramid. And he understood immediately that this was what went in the middle, and he was moved by it in a way that a 50-year-old man recounting it still found faintly ridiculous. He described the whole business as a painful admission. He was doing it because he had nothing better. He wrote that it was accompanied by constant self-criticism, and that he kept asking himself what on earth he thought he was doing. But he also said that while he was building, thoughts arrived that he had not been able to reach any other way. Hold on to this chapter, because when we get to the research in the second half, we are going to find that it is not the visions that turn out to be the important part of this story. It is this: a man in difficulty, with no idea what to do, doing something concrete with his hands daily for its own sake, and finding that his mind became available to him while he did. That is a repeatable finding. The temple in the rock is not. There is a second half to the stone building that he mentioned more briefly and that I find more useful than the village itself. He said that while he was doing it, the thinking he could not do at his desk began to happen on its own, not solutions, not insights in the tidy sense. Just that material which had been circulating uselessly started arriving in a form that could be handled, while his hands were busy with something that had nothing to do with it. Anyone who has ever solved a problem in the shower, or on a walk, or halfway through washing up, knows this from the inside. It is one of the most commonly reported experiences there is, and it is almost never designed for. We treat it as a pleasant accident rather than as a method. He treated it as a method. That is the whole difference. And notice what kind of activity it was, because the specifics matter more than they look. It was physical. It used his hands. It had no goal that mattered. It could not be done wrong. Nobody was going to see it. It happened at the same time every day, and it was mildly absorbing without being demanding. Every one of those features turns out to matter, and we will come back to all of them at the end of the night, when we assemble the small practical apparatus that this whole story reduces to. For now, hold the image. A well-known doctor, 38 years old, in a good suit, crouched at the edge of a lake after lunch, putting one wet stone on top of another and being faintly embarrassed about it for the next 50 years. Chapter the 7th of October 1913. On the train to Schaffhausen, now the flood. He was travelling alone. The vision came over him without any warning in ordinary daylight, and it did not have the quality of imagination. He was not picturing it. He was seeing it, and it did not stop when he tried to attend to something else. The detail that stayed with him was the yellow of the wreckage in the water and the fact that the sea turned to blood. He got off the train. He was, in his own description, deeply disturbed, and he did what a psychiatrist would do, which was to consider the possibilities in order. The first possibility on that list for a man with his training was not prophecy. It was that he was becoming ill. 2 weeks later, it came again, more intensely, and this time there was a voice with it, which said that it was quite real and that he should look at it. In the spring and early summer of 1914, there were 3 dreams. In April, May, and June, each of the same kind. An Arctic cold wave descending in the middle of summer, freezing the land, killing everything green. He was by then more or less convinced that he was facing a psychosis, and he had the professional knowledge to know exactly what that would cost him. And I want to be precise about the ordering here because it is the crux of the whole thing, and it is very frequently reported the wrong way round. He did not know what the visions meant. He had no reason to think they were about anything beyond himself. He assumed, for months, that they were symptoms. What he did with them, he did while believing they were symptoms. That is the fact that makes the next 6 years worth 3 hours of your night. It is worth being careful about what a vision of that kind actually is, because the word carries a great deal of baggage, and most of it is unhelpful. He was not asleep. He was not in a trance. He did not lose awareness of where he was, and he did not, at any point, mistake the flood for something happening in the carriage. He knew he was on a train. What he described is closer to something being played at full brightness over the top of ordinary perception, without permission, for a sustained period, while the ordinary perception continues underneath it. That is a real and documented category. It has a range. It includes the extremely common experience of a memory arriving so vividly that you briefly stop seeing the road. And it includes states that require medical attention. And there is a great deal of territory in between, where most people live and almost nobody talks. 2 things made his instance frightening rather than merely striking. The first was the duration. A flash is one thing, an hour is another, and an hour is what he reported. The second was that it repeated 2 weeks later without being sought, and then the dreams followed in April, May, and June. Repetition is what converts an odd experience into a fear about oneself. One strange evening is a story you tell. The same strange evening arriving again, uninvited, on a schedule you do not control, is a different object entirely. And everybody who has had anything come back at them that way knows the specific cold feeling of the second time. One more thing about that autumn, because it explains a great deal about the pace of what follows. He did nothing for 2 months. The first vision was in October. The dreams ran through the spring, and the evening at the desk, the one everybody quotes, was the 12th of December. Between the arrival of the thing and his first deliberate response to it, he spent weeks simply carrying it, going to work, seeing patients, and saying almost nothing to anybody. That interval is worth noticing because the way this story is usually told compresses it to nothing, and the compression makes him look decisive in a way he was not. He was not decisive. He was frightened for 2 months, and then, having exhausted the alternatives, did the only thing left. Which is, in my experience, how nearly all of it actually goes. The move that eventually helps almost never arrives as a brave decision. It arrives as the last option standing, taken by somebody who has run out of better ideas, on an ordinary evening without ceremony. If you are waiting to feel resolute before you do the thing you already know you should do, you may be waiting for a state that does not precede action. It usually follows it by some months. Chapter 8. What a psychiatrist knows that you do not. To understand how frightening this was, you need to know what he knew. He had spent 9 years at the Bergholzli. In that period, he had personally examined and cared for a very large number of people with schizophrenia, at a time when there was no treatment for it whatsoever. He had written a book about it. He had sat with people through the whole arc of it. So when his own mind produced a flood, he was not able to enjoy it. He had a mental filing system for exactly this, built out of hundreds of real cases, and it did not have a category called interesting personal development. It had a category that ended in a locked ward. And he had one further piece of knowledge that made it worse, which was that the people he had cared for had, at the beginning, been able to describe their experiences with complete lucidity, exactly as he was now describing his. Insight is not a defense. He knew that. There is a version of this available to you at 1 a.m, on a much smaller scale, and it is worth naming because it is the same shape. It is the moment when you notice that you are having an unusual experience, and then notice that noticing does not make it stop, and then wonder whether noticing counts for anything at all. It does count. We will come to why, and to what the last 40 years of research says about how common all of this is. but he did not have that research, and he had a great deal of first-hand evidence pointing the other way, and I would rather you understood how alone he was with it before we get to the part where it turns out well. I want to put one more thing beside that, because it goes to why he did what he did next, rather than what almost anybody else would have done. The obvious move for a man in his position was to tell nobody. He had a practice full of patients whose confidence depended on his stability. He had a professional reputation in a young field that was fighting for scientific respectability, and nothing would have damaged that faster than the head of the Psychoanalytic Association reporting visions. He had a wife and 5 children. Every incentive available to him pointed at silence and at waiting to see whether it went away. And silence is what most people choose in the smaller version tonight. Not because they are cowards, because the cost of saying it out loud is concrete and immediate, and the cost of not saying it is vague and deferred, and human beings are extremely bad at pricing that trade. He did not choose silence, but I want to be accurate about what he did choose, because it was not confession either. He did not go to a colleague. He did not seek treatment. He told very few people at the time. What he did instead was write it down every night in a notebook nobody would read. That is a third option that most people never consider, and it turns out to be the one that carries most of the effect. Not telling the world, not carrying it alone in your head, getting it out of your head and onto a surface where it becomes an object with edges without yet involving anybody else at all. Chapter 9. The 12th of December, 1913. By December, he had decided. The reasoning, as he later gave it, was not brave. It was closer to arithmetic. He was afraid of losing control of himself. But he had also noticed something during the stone building, which was that the material only became manageable when he did something with it deliberately. So he concluded that if the images were going to come, whether he liked it or not, the one variable available to him was whether he was standing there when they arrived. He sat at his desk in the evening. He described going over his fears once more, and then he let himself drop. That is the phrase. He let himself drop deliberately, the way you would step off something. He described the sensation of soft ground under his feet, and then of falling into darkness, and then of standing in a low cave with a dwarf beside him, mummified, and cold water running, and a crystal glowing in the light. And behind the crystal, a stream, and in the stream the body of a young man with fair hair and a head wound, and then a black scarab, and then a red sun rising through the water, and then the water turned to blood. He came out of it and did not know what he had been looking at. I want to make an observation about this that is unfashionable and I think correct. The content of that vision is not the interesting part. It is a jumble of imagery. Any competent dream in any ordinary person contains something as strange. If you tried to explain your last vivid dream to somebody at breakfast, you would produce something equally arbitrary and equally embarrassing, and they would be politely bored. What is interesting is the procedure. He was afraid of the images, so he went to them at a time of his choosing, at his own desk, having decided in advance to do it, and he came back and he wrote it down. He converted an ambush into an appointment. There is a phrase in his account of that evening that is easy to skim past, and that, I think, is the operative detail of the entire 6 years. He decided in advance. He did not drop because he was overwhelmed. He dropped at a time of his choosing, at his own desk, having thought about it, in a house where his family were asleep upstairs and would be there in the morning. Compare that with what had been happening to him for the previous 2 months, which was that the material arrived when it liked, in daylight, on trains, and left him rearranged. Same material. 2 completely different experiences of it, and the only variable is who set the time. This is worth taking because it has a small and immediately available version. The thing that makes a difficult thought unbearable at 1 a.m. is very rarely its content. It is that it arrives unannounced, in a state you did not choose, at an hour when you have no resources, and stays as long as it likes. Almost every technique that works on it is, underneath, a way of converting an ambush into an appointment. Not stopping the thought, not answering it, just moving it to a time and a place you selected, and being able to say, credibly, not now, we do this at 11. That only works if you actually do it at 11. He did his version every night for 6 years. Chapter 10. The rule he made for himself. He kept doing it. Through the end of 1913 and all through 1914 and beyond, night after night, sitting in his study after the household had gone quiet, deliberately dropping. And in the middle of that, he formulated a rule which is, in my view, the single most important sentence in this entire story. And it is not the sentence anybody quotes. The rule was that nothing was permitted to remain interior. Every image had to be written. Every figure had to be given words. Where he could not manage words, he was to draw it or paint it. Nothing was allowed to stay in his head as a private feeling that he simply carried around. He was explicit about the reason. He wrote that to the extent that he managed to translate the emotions into images and to find the pictures that were concealed inside the emotions, he was inwardly calmed and reassured. And he added the counterfactual, which is the part that matters. He said that if he had left those images hidden in the emotions, he might have been torn to pieces by them. Now, notice what is being claimed there, because it is not a mystical claim at all. He is not saying the images were healing. He is not saying the unconscious is wise. He is saying something almost mechanical. An emotion that stays an emotion has no edges and no end, and it will circulate indefinitely. An emotion that has been turned into a specific picture with a specific shape on a specific page is now an object. It is outside you. It is finite. You can look at it, put it down, and go to bed. Every functioning thing we will find in the research in the second half of tonight is a version of that sentence. It is worth pressing on why that rule is not obvious, because on first hearing it sounds like ordinary advice about journaling, and it is not. The ordinary version says, write down how you feel and you will feel better. His version says something almost opposite. He was not writing down how he felt. He said that when he could not manage words, he was to draw it, and when he could not draw it, he was to paint it, and the object of the exercise was to find the picture that was hidden inside the emotion. That is not expression, that is translation, and it has a criterion of success. Either you have found the specific image, or you have not. An emotion has no edges. It can expand to fill any amount of time you give it, and it never terminates, because there is nothing in it that could be finished. A picture has edges by definition. It is this and not that. It is a particular size. When you have drawn it, it is drawn. So the operation converts an unbounded thing into a bounded one, and the boundedness is the entire therapeutic content. He is not saying the images were wise or that the unconscious was benevolent. He is saying that a thing with a shape can be set down, and a thing without one cannot. Everything at the end of tonight is a variation on that single sentence, arrived at independently with control groups 90 years later. Chapter 11. Elijah, Salome, and the notebooks. Around this period he encountered 3 figures who kept returning, and they are worth describing because of what he eventually did with them rather than because of what they were. An old man with a white beard who called himself Elijah. A blind young woman who called herself Salome. And a large black snake which was with them. He spoke with them. Elijah did most of the talking, and Jung found him credible and reasonable. Salome he did not trust and was made uneasy by, and he said so. The snake behaved like an animal, taking an interest in him. Here is what I want you to notice. He argued with them. He did not receive them as revelation. He questioned Elijah about what he was saying. He told Salome that he found her disturbing. He treated the whole encounter the way you would treat meeting 3 strangers on a road, which is to say, with attention and some suspicion. And afterwards, in daylight, he analyzed the material as a psychiatrist. Where did those names come from? What in his reading had supplied them? What in his own life was being represented? Both at once. That is the whole method. And it is the thing that separates what he did from every superficially similar thing. There is one more figure from this period who deserves a mention, because she appears constantly in the black notebooks and almost never in the popular retellings. He addressed a great deal of the material to what he simply called his soul, and he wrote to her the way you would write to somebody who was in the room. He asked her questions. He complained. He accused her of abandoning him for long periods, which she had, because there were stretches of months when nothing came at all and he sat at the desk anyway. And she was not agreeable. That is the thing that makes those pages worth reading rather than embarrassing. The figure argues back. She tells him that he is being pompous, that he has confused scholarship with life, that he wants results and is not entitled to them. At one point, she informs him that what he calls his science is a way of avoiding the very thing he claims to be investigating. Whatever you think that is, it is not a man flattering himself. And it establishes something about the whole enterprise that the sensational version obscures completely. The material was not comforting. He did not come away from those evenings uplifted. He frequently came away irritated or humiliated or told something about himself that he did not want to know, by a voice that was noticeably less impressed with him than he was. That is a much better sign than the alternative would be. A voice in your head that only ever agrees with you is not an interlocutor. It is you with the lights off. He took the experience completely seriously while it was happening, and he took it completely skeptically afterwards, and he refused to give up either half. The physical record of all this is 6 small black-bound journals. They are not impressive objects. They are notebooks. He wrote in them in ordinary handwriting, dated sometimes at speed, and they run from November 1913 through to the 1930s. They were not published until 2020, more than a century after they were written, in 7 volumes with a facsimile of every page. And the reason I want you to have them clearly in mind is that when people describe this period, they usually describe the beautiful book. And the beautiful book is a work of art made afterwards. The notebooks are the actual event. They are what a man wrote at night when he did not know what was happening to him. There is something in that which is worth taking for yourself. The record that helps is not the beautiful one. It is the cheap notebook written badly at the time by somebody who does not yet know how the story ends. Chapter 12. What he was doing during the day. It is very easy at this point in the telling to imagine a man consumed, a recluse. Somebody who has gone into a room and shut the door on his life. That is not what happened, and the correction is important enough that Jung himself insisted on it repeatedly. Through the whole of this period, he continued to see patients. He continued to run the household at Kusnacht. He continued to be a husband and the father of 5 children, the youngest of whom was born in 1914. He continued to publish. He served in the Swiss Army Medical Corps. He was explicit about why he thought this mattered. He wrote that his family and his profession remained the base to which he could always return, that they were a reassurance that he was a normal, existing person, and that the unconscious contents could have driven him out of his wits if he had not had that. He said, in effect, that the thing that kept him from being destroyed by it was that he had to be at work in the morning. There is more evidence for that than his own word, and it is worth having. In 1916, in the middle of all this, he was one of the founders of the Psychological Club in Zurich, an organization with premises, a membership, minutes, and internal politics. He gave lectures to it. He sat through its arguments. Anyone who has ever been on the committee of a small institution will understand that this is the least mystical activity available to a human being, and he was doing it in the same months as the 7 sermons. He was also, throughout, a working analyst with a full practice, and the practice was not incidental to the experience. Several of the ideas that came out of those years were tested first on clinical material, because he had a room full of people every week whose dreams he was already writing down. When something arrived in his own material, he had somewhere to check it that was not his own head. And there was his wife Emma. She was not a bystander in this. She trained, practiced, and became a serious analyst in her own right, publishing on the Anima and Animus and on the Grail legend, and she was, by all accounts, a formidable and unsentimental person. Whatever else was true of that household, there was somebody in it who understood the theory well enough to disagree with him about it. The other person usually named in accounts of this period is Tony Wolfe, who had been his patient, then his colleague, and who became his closest working companion during the confrontation and for decades afterwards. The nature of that arrangement, and what it cost Emma Jung, has been written about at length by people with better sources than this recording has. I am not going to pretend it was simple or that it was fair. What is relevant here, and all that is relevant here, is that during the years he was going down into that material, he had a second person who knew exactly what he was doing and could follow him into it, and he said plainly that without her, he might not have got out. So the honest picture is not a solitary genius wrestling alone. It is a man with a household, a wife who was also a professional, a colleague who understood the work, a club with minutes and a diary full of appointments, who went down into it in the evenings and came back up in the mornings because there were people expecting him. Almost everything that distinguishes his outcome from the worse outcomes is in that sentence, and none of it is heroic. I would ask you to hold on to that, because in the last hour of tonight it becomes the difference between two men. One of them had a practice, a wife, 5 children, and a lake. The other one had a rented room in a boarding house and no one expecting him at breakfast, and the ideas that came to him were at least as large. Chapter the 13th of August, 1914. On the 1st of August 1914, the war began. Jung was in Aberdeen at a conference of the British Medical Association, at which he had been invited to give a lecture on the importance of the unconscious in psychopathology. He got home to Switzerland with some difficulty, and of course he immediately connected it to the visions. The flood, the blood, the Arctic cold coming down over Europe in the middle of summer. The dreams of April, May, and June, and then in August, the thing itself. He wrote that he had the feeling that an overwhelming task had been laid on him, and that he now understood the visions had not been about him at all. Now, we have to be careful here, and I am going to be more careful than most tellings of this story are. The claim that Jung predicted the First World War is not a claim we should let past. Consider what was actually true in 1913 and early 1914 in Europe. 2 Balkan wars had just been fought. An arms race between Britain and Germany had been running for over a decade and was public knowledge. Alliances had been visibly hardening for years. There was a widespread and well-documented cultural expectation across Europe that a great war was coming, and it appears in the letters, the newspapers, the novels, and the paintings of the period. A mind saturated in that atmosphere, which had recently detached itself from every stabilizing structure and had opened its floor, producing an image of Europe drowning, is not evidence of second sight. It is evidence that the machinery downstairs had been reading the room. And the honest position is that this makes it more interesting rather than less, because it demonstrates the actual function. The material coming up was not information from elsewhere. It was information from him, assembled out of things he already knew and had not consciously added together. That is a real capacity, it is well documented, and it is available to you. What arrives at 1 in the morning is very often a conclusion you already had the evidence for and had not permitted yourself to reach. There is a wider point buried in that, and it is one of the more useful things a person can carry. We are extremely poor at knowing where our own conclusions came from. He believed for months that the flood was about him. It was not an unreasonable belief. It was the only hypothesis available, and it was the frightening one, and he lived under it. And the thing that eventually reframed it was not insight, it was an event in the external world that arrived and made a different reading possible. That happens constantly, and almost nobody notices it happening. A conviction you have been carrying for years, which feels like a settled fact about yourself, turns out to have been a hypothesis you adopted early because it was the only one on the table, and it dissolves the moment a different reading becomes available, which is worth remembering when the certainty at 1 in the morning presents itself as knowledge rather than as a reading. It is very often a reading. It is very often the first one you were offered, adopted at a time when you had no alternatives, and kept because nothing has since arrived to displace it. That is not the same as being false. It is only a reminder that the confidence attached to it is a feature of its solitude, not of its accuracy. There is a small coda to the war material that is worth having because it cuts against a tidy reading. The visions did not stop once he had an explanation for them. If the flood had been about Europe, and Europe duly flooded in August 1914, you would expect the matter to be closed. Question asked, question answered, mind at rest. It was not. The material kept coming for another 5 years, in a form that had nothing to do with politics, and the most intense of it was still ahead of him, which tells you that the explanation, whatever comfort it gave, was not what settled him. That is a useful and slightly deflating fact. We tend to assume that what we need is to understand the thing, and that once we do, it will subside. Very often it does not. Understanding arrives, is genuinely satisfying for about a day, and the thing goes on exactly as before, because whatever is generating it was never waiting for an explanation. What settled him was not the interpretation, it was the practice. The desk, the notebook, the hour, every night, for years. The understanding was a byproduct, and it arrived late, and it was not the medicine. Chapter 14, Philemon. And then, out of the same process, came the figure that mattered more to him than any of the others. An old man with a white beard, with the horns of a bull and the wings of a kingfisher, carrying 4 keys. One of them held as if about to open a lock. He called himself Philemon. He painted him. The painting is in the Red Book, and it is one of the more arresting objects in 20th century psychology, mostly because it is so obviously made with love. He said Philemon taught him things he had not thought. And then he described the conversation that is the reason this figure matters, and which I would put on the wall of every consulting room in the world. Philemon told him that he was mistaken about his own thoughts. Jung had assumed, as everybody assumes, that he made his thoughts, that they were his production, that he was their author. And Philemon said, no. He said the thoughts were like animals in a forest, or people in a room, or birds in the air. He said that if you saw people in a room, you would not say you had made them, or that you were responsible for them. Jung wrote that it was this figure who taught him the objectivity of the psyche, that the contents of his own mind had a reality that was not his doing. He also wrote, and this is the part that gets left out, that Philemon was a figure who was clearly not himself, and that this was the crucial thing about him. A voice that is presented as yours has authority over you. A voice that presents itself as a separate person in the room can be listened to or disagreed with or shown the door. Which of those two arrangements you are in, at 1 a.m, is not a small detail. It is nearly everything, and we will come back to it with evidence. I want to slow down on the specific claim being made in that exchange, because it is stranger than it first appears, and it is the intellectual center of the whole 6 years. The ordinary picture of a mind is that there is one of you in there doing the thinking, and that the thoughts are the output of that one person. What the figure says is that this is a mistake of the same kind as walking into a room full of people and concluding that you have produced them. Now, you can take that literally, and a certain amount of writing about Jung does. I am not going to, and neither did he, in his more careful moods. The defensible version is much smaller and is not disputed by anybody. A great deal of what your mind produces is generated by processes you have no access to, arrives, finished, and is then experienced as yours because it appeared inside your head. Authorship is inferred, not observed. You do not watch yourself compose a sentence, you notice that one has appeared and assume you wrote it. Once you have really taken that in, a certain amount of self-torture becomes optional, because the harsh sentence that arrives at 1 a.m. is being credited to you. It feels like your verdict on yourself, delivered from the center of who you actually are. It is not. It is a production. Something made it, and something made it out of old material, and the fact that it appeared in your head is not evidence that it represents you. Chapter 15. The Kingfisher. There is a story attached to Philemon that I am going to tell you, and then immediately put in its proper place, because this is where a lot of retellings of this material quietly go over the edge. Jung said that one day, after painting Philemon with his kingfisher wings, he was walking in the garden by the lake and found a dead kingfisher. Kingfishers, he noted, are rare in the area around Zurich, and he had never before found a dead one. The body was recently dead, a day or two at most, with no visible injuries. That is the story. It appears in memories, dreams, reflections. Now the placement. This is a single anecdote told once by an old man about an event roughly 45 years earlier in a book assembled by somebody else. There is no contemporaneous record of it. There is no witness. There is no note in the black notebooks saying, "Today found a kingfisher." I am not calling him a liar. Memory does not require dishonesty in order to be wrong, and everybody who has ever told a good story about their own life has, without noticing, tidied it. What I want to point out is something more interesting than whether it happened. Notice what it does to the story if it is true, and notice what it does if it is not. And then notice that in both cases, the thing that actually mattered to Jung and the thing that actually changed his life was the painting, not the bird. He had spent months learning to give shape to the material coming out of him. The painting of Philemon is a real object that took real hours. It exists. You can look at it. It is on page 154 of the folio. The dead kingfisher, if it happened, is a coincidence that decorated a process which was already working. We will meet this pattern again several times tonight, and it is worth having a name for it. The remarkable coincidence is what people remember. The unremarkable daily labor is what produced the result. There is a general rule hiding behind this chapter, and it is worth stating on its own, because it applies to a great deal more than dead kingfishers. Every long project of self-repair accumulates two kinds of material: the daily grind that produces the result, and the handful of uncanny moments that make the story tellable. And when the person recounts it afterwards, the ratio inverts completely. The years of dull labor compress into a sentence, and the three strange coincidences get a chapter each. That is not dishonesty. It is what narrative does. Nobody can tell 6 years of nightly notebook entries as a story, and everybody can tell the bit about the bird. But it means that when you read anybody's account of how they got through something, you are reading a document in which the causally important material has been squeezed out to make room for the memorable material, which has a direct consequence for you tonight. If you are comparing your own situation to somebody else's account of theirs, and concluding that nothing remarkable is happening in yours, and that therefore nothing is working, you are comparing your ordinary Tuesday against their edited highlights. The absence of a dead kingfisher is not evidence that the process is failing. In his case, the dull part was the process. The bird was decoration. Chapter 16. What active imagination is and the rule inside it. Out of 6 years of doing this, he distilled a method, and he gave it a name that is much duller than the thing itself. He called it active imagination. The procedure, stripped of the mythology, has 4 steps. First, you empty out. You put down the ordinary run of the day and let your attention become quiet, without going to sleep. He was clear that this is the hard part, and that most people either stay in their to-do list or fall asleep. Second, you let an image come, and you do not choose it. Something arrives. A figure, a place, a scene. You do not construct it, and you do not steer it. Third, and this is the step that distinguishes it from daydreaming entirely, you enter it as yourself. You do not watch. You go in as the person you actually are, with your actual opinions, and you interact. You speak to the figure. You ask it what it wants. You disagree with it. You are not obliged to be polite. Fourth, you do something with what came out of it. You write it down or you paint it, and then in daylight you take an ethical position on it. You decide What, if anything, in the ordinary world you are going to do differently? That fourth step is the one that gets dropped by almost everybody who tries it, and Jung was scathing about people who dropped it. He said that without it, the whole thing is an aesthetic entertainment and a form of self-indulgence. Now, the warning, and I mean it. I am not suggesting you do this. Jung developed it as a working psychiatrist, inside a practice, with colleagues, in a household full of people who would notice if he stopped coming to dinner. He was explicit that it was not suitable for everyone, and he specifically believed it could be dangerous for people whose grip on their own boundaries was already loose. If your mind at night is producing things that frighten you, the correct move is not to open the door wider, it is to talk to somebody who is qualified in daylight. What is worth taking from this chapter is not the technique. It is the shape of the technique, which we will find later tonight, has been independently rediscovered by researchers who had never read a word of Jung. Here is the distinction the whole method rests on in one sentence. There is a difference between having a thought and being it. Jung's word for the failure mode is inflation. It describes what happens when the ego does not stay separate from the material coming up and instead merges with it. The person does not have a great idea. The person becomes the great idea, and after that, there is nobody left in the room to evaluate it. The mechanism by which he avoided it was almost childishly simple. He gave the contents faces and names and let them be other people. Philemon was not him. Elijah was not him. And because they were not him, he could disagree with them, get annoyed with them, ask them to explain themselves, and go and have dinner. Compare that with the ordinary experience at 1 a.m, where the voice saying you have wasted your life is not experienced as a figure standing in the room. It is experienced as you. It is experienced as the truth arriving from the center of yourself with nobody to appeal to. That is the same content in a much worse arrangement. And I want to be careful not to oversell this, because the honest version is smaller than the enthusiastic version. Naming a thought does not make it go away and does not make it wrong. What it does is put a small distance between the thought and the person having it, and it turns out, from a body of research we will come to shortly, that this small distance measurably changes how much the thought hurts and how long it runs. Not a cure, a handle. Chapter 17. The Sermons and the Circles. In the winter of 1916, something happened in the house at Kusnacht which the family talked about for the rest of their lives. By his account, the house became restless over a period of days. The atmosphere was oppressive. His eldest daughter reported seeing a figure. His son had a disturbing dream and drew a picture of it in the morning without being asked. The doorbell rang and the maid found no one there, and Jung, who was sitting where he could see the door, also saw no one. And in that state he sat down and wrote, in 3 evenings, a short text in a deliberately archaic and prophetic style, which he titled 7 Sermons to the Dead. He did not sign it with his own name. He attributed it to Basilides of Alexandria, a Gnostic teacher of the 2nd century. He had a small number of copies privately printed and gave them to a few people. He never published it commercially in his lifetime, and he was later faintly embarrassed by it, describing it as a sin of his youth, even though he was 41 at the time. It is the only part of the entire Red Book material that left his house before he died. I include this chapter for two reasons. The first is that it is a genuinely strange episode with multiple witnesses in the household, and leaving it out would be dishonest. The second is what he did with it, which is the pattern of the whole story. Something arrived that he did not author. He wrote it down immediately. He gave it away to a fictional author from the 2nd century, which is another version of the same move. This is not mine. This is a text by somebody else. I am the one who transcribed it. He kept doing the same thing. Whatever came, he put a boundary around it and handed it a name that was not his own. In 1917 and 1918, Jung was in the Swiss army, serving as the commandant of an internment camp at Château d'Aux in the mountains, where British soldiers who had been interned in Switzerland were housed. It was not a hardship posting, it was administrative, and every morning, before the day's work, he drew a small circular design in a notebook. He did not know why. He drew what corresponded to his inner situation that morning, and over weeks he began to notice that the drawings changed with his state, and that on days when something was wrong, the circle came out broken or lopsided. He called them mandalas, from the Sanskrit for circle, having encountered the term in the Eastern material he had been reading. The point of this chapter is not the symbolism, it is the routine. A man in the middle of the strangest years of his life, in a job that required him to be somewhere at a fixed time, began each day by making a small object that recorded where he was. Not analyzing, not solving. Recording. He wrote later that he had the distinct sense during those years of being on a path that led to an unknown goal, and that the drawings were the only way he could tell whether he was still on it. There is a version of that available to any person in any circumstances, and it costs nothing, and it does not require you to believe in anything. Something small every morning that leaves a trace of where you actually were. When you are in a period you cannot see the shape of from inside, the trace is the only instrument you have. Chapter 18. Making the object. Now the book itself, because it is a physical thing and the physical facts of it are extraordinary. Beginning around 1915, he started transcribing the material from the black notebooks into a large folio volume bound in red leather. It is a substantial object, the size of a lectern Bible. He wrote in it in a careful medieval hand, using an italic, calligraphic script he had to teach himself, in black ink with initials and headings in color. He painted illuminations, some of them full page. He was not a trained artist, and he knew it, and he worked slowly. He also did something on that page which is easy to miss. He did not simply copy the material across. He added a second layer, a running commentary, in which the man of 1915 and 1917 and 1920 interprets and argues with what the man of 1913 wrote down. So the object is three things at once. It is a record of the experiences, it is a work of art, and it is a conversation between him and his own earlier self, conducted on the page over years. He worked on it for around 16 years. And I want to say something plain about that, because it is the least mystical and most important fact in this whole story. 16 years of quiet, slow, manual, non-urgent work on an object nobody was waiting for, that would earn him nothing, that he would not publish, that had no deadline, and that no one but him would ever see. That is not what a man in crisis does. That is what a man does who has found a place to put a crisis. The physical facts are worth a moment longer because they tell you something the story alone does not. He wrote it on parchment. He had to learn the script, which is a formal italic hand of a kind that had not been in ordinary use for centuries, and learning it took time he did not have. The paints were expensive and unforgiving. You do not correct them. Several of the full-page images would have taken days each, and one or two of them looked like weeks. He did all of that in the evenings after seeing patients. And he made errors. There are places where a letter goes wrong and is worked around rather than scraped out, and places where the ruling is visible under the text, and one or two pages where you can see him losing patience for the ornament. I find those pages more moving than the finished ones, and I think there is something in them worth taking. He was not good at this. He was a middle-aged doctor teaching himself calligraphy and illumination in his spare time, and the results are the results of a gifted amateur working extremely hard, not of a master. The book is beautiful in the way a thing made carefully by somebody who cared is beautiful, which is a different quality from skill and is available to anybody. Whatever you might make, in whatever spare hours you have, it will not be as good as the professionals. That has almost nothing to do with whether it will do for you what this did for him. What did the work was not the quality of the object. It was the hours of quiet attention that the object required, and an amateur's hours are exactly as long as a master's. Chapter 19, where he stopped and 50 years in a cupboard. He never finished it. Work on the folio tailed off around 1930. The last page of calligraphy breaks off in the middle of a sentence. Two things happened around then. The first is that in 1928, the sinologist Richard Wilhelm sent him a Chinese alchemical text called The Secret of the Golden Flower, and Jung read it and found, to his considerable shock, that a tradition he had never heard of had been describing the same processes in different language for centuries. He said it was the first event that broke his isolation. Until then, he had been alone with material that nobody around him could confirm. Now here was a text from another civilization, written by people with no connection to him at all, containing his mandalas. The second is that he had, by then, found a language in which to say it publicly. From 1930 onwards, the alchemical work begins, and it occupies him for the rest of his life. He effectively translated the whole private experience into a historical and scholarly idiom in which it could be published, argued about, and taught, which is a slightly deflating ending, and I think an honest and rather moving one. He did not finish the beautiful book because he no longer needed to make it. He had found other people to talk to. The folios stayed in the family. For a long period, it was in a cupboard at the house in Kusnacht. In 1984, it was moved to a bank vault in Zurich. The family refused access. Scholars asked and were declined repeatedly for decades. There were reasons which are not sinister and are quite human. Jung had never published it. The material is intensely personal, and it is not, on the surface, a document that makes a man look like a scientist. The negotiation to publish it took years, and the person who eventually carried it through was the historian Sonu Shamdasani, who spent something like 3 years persuading the family and then more than a decade on the edition. It was published in October 2009, a facsimile at close to full size, with a translation and an introduction of about 100 pages. For an academic art object of that price and weight, it did something nobody expected. The first printing sold out. It went through multiple printings. It appeared in the general press. People who had never read a page of Jung bought it and put it on a table. And I think the reason for that is worth stating, because it has nothing to do with Jung. The appeal was not the psychology, it was the object. A man, in the worst years of his life, made something slowly, by hand, beautifully, for no audience, and it survived him by half a century and then arrived intact. That is a very consoling shape, and people recognized it immediately. One further thing about the ending, and it is a correction to a story people like too much. The Red Book is often presented as a suppressed masterpiece that was finally liberated, with the family cast as obstacles and the scholars as heroes. That is not fair to anybody involved. The man himself did not publish it, over 42 years in which he could have published anything he liked. He was not prevented. He chose not to, repeatedly, and gave reasons, and the family were not sitting on a treasure out of malice. They were the custodians of a private document written by a father and a grandfather at the worst period of his life, in a form that made him look, to an unsympathetic reader, exactly like the thing his critics said he was. Any family in that position would hesitate, and most would hesitate longer. What eventually moved it was not a campaign. It was one historian spending years earning trust, and then more than a decade doing the work properly. I mention it because the sensational version of this story needs a villain, and there is not one. And the absence of a villain is itself a small useful fact about how difficult things actually get resolved. Mostly not by confrontation, mostly by somebody patient turning up for a very long time. There is one further thing about those 50 years in a cupboard, and it is the only genuinely consoling thing I have to say about time. The object survived without being used. For decades it did nothing. It sat in a house, then in a vault. It earned nothing, changed nothing, and helped nobody. By any measure available at the time, it was a completed waste. 16 years of a busy man's evenings, producing a thing that was neither published, nor useful, nor even seen. And then it came out, and it turned out to have been waiting rather than wasted. I am not going to build a general principle out of one book, because for every object that turns out to have been waiting, there are 100 that were simply wasted, and the ones we hear about are selected by their endings. But it is worth holding lightly at 1 in the morning when the mind is running its inventory of things you started and did not finish, and presenting each of them as evidence. Some of them were wasted. Some of them are waiting. And at 1 in the morning, in the dark, with no new information available, you are in the worst possible position to sort them into the 2 piles, and under no obligation to try tonight. Chapter 20. What we are actually asking, and a word about the register. We are at the halfway point, and this is where we change gear. The story is over. From here to the end, we are going to look at what has actually been established about minds that do the things his mind did. Because the story on its own is only an anecdote. And one anecdote about an unusual man in 1913 is not a reason to change how you think about your own head. And I want to be precise about the question, because it is not the question people usually ask. The question is not, was Jung mad? That is an unanswerable and slightly prurient question about a dead man, and we will deal with it properly in a few chapters and then set it aside. The question is this: when a mind produces material its owner did not author, what is actually happening? How common is it, and what determines whether it wrecks a person or does not? Those are answerable. There is now a large, unglamorous, careful literature on all 3, and almost none of it has reached the general public, because the general public's ideas on this subject were formed by films. The short version, which we are going to spend the rest of the night filling in, is that the raw experience is far more common than anybody thinks, that it is not by itself a sign of illness, that what happens next depends heavily on things that are not medical at all, and that there is one distinction, well supported and easy to describe, which separates the kind of night thinking that helps from the kind that grinds. Jung stumbled into the first kind. Most of us, lying awake, are doing the second. Before the research, one short chapter about how this story is usually sold, because you will meet it if you go looking, and I would like you to be inoculated. Search for this material, and you will find it described as the most dangerous book in psychology. The book they did not want you to read. Banned for 80 years. The forbidden text. The secret Jung took to his grave. None of that is true, and it is worth knowing why it is not true, because the actual facts are more interesting. It was not banned. There has never been a jurisdiction in which it was illegal. It was a private document owned by a family who declined to publish it, which is a right every family has over its own papers. It was not hidden in the sense of being suppressed. Its existence was public knowledge for decades. It is referred to in memories, dreams, reflections, which sold in enormous numbers from 1963 onwards. It contains no secret teaching. It contains one man's account of his own inner experience in an ornate style, plus paintings. And Jung did not take it to his grave in any meaningful sense. He talked about the period constantly in lectures, in seminars, and in print for 40 years. I labor this because the sensational framing costs something real. It converts a story about a frightened man doing careful daily work into a story about hidden knowledge, and the second story is useless to you. If the reason the Red Book helps is that it contains a secret, then it can only help people who get the secret. If the reason it helps is that a man wrote things down every night for 6 years until they stopped ambushing him, then it is available to anybody with a notebook. The second one is the true one. Chapter 21. Creative Illness. Now, the first serious attempt to place what happened to Jung inside a category was made by a Swiss historian of psychiatry named Henri Ellenberger in a very large book published in 1970 called The Discovery of the Unconscious. Ellenberger noticed a pattern running through the biographies of a particular kind of thinker that did not fit any standard diagnosis. He called it creative illness. The pattern has a shape. It begins after a period of intense preoccupation with a problem. The person then enters a phase of prolonged suffering, isolation and self-absorption, in which they are convinced something is deeply wrong with them, and during which they nevertheless continue to work on the problem, sometimes obsessively. The phase lasts a long time, often years. It ends, not gradually, but relatively suddenly, with a sense of relief and elation. And the person comes out permanently changed, holding a new idea that they then spend the rest of their life developing and which they regard as having been given rather than worked out. Ellenberger applied this to several figures, including Freud during his self-analysis in the 1890s, and to Jung between 1913 and 1919. Now, I want to be honest about the status of this idea because I like it, and that is exactly when you have to be careful. Creative illness is a historian's category, not a clinical one. It is not in any diagnostic manual. It was built by looking backwards at a small number of famous people who all, by definition, came out the other side and produced something. Nobody has counted the people who entered the same state and did not produce anything because they do not get biographies. So it is a description, and a good one, and it is not evidence of anything. What it does do is establish something that matters. As early as 1970, a serious historian of psychiatry looking at this material concluded that the standard categories did not fit it well. That was not special pleading for a hero. It was a professional judgment that something else was going on. There is one more thing worth saying about the category, because it explains something about the shape of these episodes that people find frightening while they are inside them. In every case, Ellenberger describes, the person does not know at the time that it is going anywhere. That is not a detail. It is the defining feature. Read from the outside, with the ending known, the whole thing looks purposeful. A descent, a struggle, an emergence, a discovery. It has the shape of a story because we are reading it backwards from an outcome. From the inside, there was no shape at all. There was a Tuesday, and then another Tuesday, and no evidence whatever that any of it was leading anywhere, and a great deal of evidence that it was not. So if you are currently inside something and cannot see its shape, that is not a sign that it has no shape. It is a description of what being inside anything is like. I am not going to tell you that yours is a creative illness, or that something is being built. I have no idea, and neither does anybody else, and one of the honest things about Ellenberger's category is that it was assembled entirely from people who came out the other side and produced something, which means the sample was chosen by the outcome. The only thing I would offer is the smaller and more defensible claim. The absence of visible progress is not evidence of absence of progress. It is the normal experience of the middle of anything. Chapter 22. People who hear voices and are not ill. The research that actually changes the picture began in the Netherlands in the late 1980s, and it started, as good research sometimes does, with a patient telling a doctor he was wrong. A Dutch psychiatrist named Marius Romme had a patient, Patsy Hage, who heard voices. He was treating her along conventional lines. She put a question to him that he could not answer. She asked why, if he did not believe her voices were real, he could offer her no way of living with them. They took an unusual step. They went on Dutch television and asked anybody in the country who heard voices to get in touch. Several hundred people did. And when Rom and his colleague Sandra Escher sorted the responses, they found something that had not been visible from inside a clinic. A substantial proportion of the people who wrote in were not patients. They had never been patients. They heard voices, sometimes for decades, and were working, married, raising children, and managing. That finding is obvious in retrospect and was invisible before, for a structural reason worth pausing on. Psychiatry sees the people who come to it. If hearing voices is distressing enough to bring you to a clinic, you are in the sample. If it is not, you are not. So for a century, the entire evidence base about voice hearing came exclusively from people for whom it was going badly. That is not a subtle bias. That is like studying alcohol exclusively in hospitals. What Rom and Escher then found, comparing the two groups, is the part that matters for tonight. The difference between the people who were coping and the people who were not was not the loudness of the voices or how often they came, or even, mostly, what they said. The difference was the relationship. The people who coped tended to experience the voices as something separate from themselves, something they could set boundaries with, something they had some negotiating position against. The people who were overwhelmed tended to experience them as omnipotent, as having authority, as not being answerable. I would like you to notice how precisely that maps onto the previous half of tonight, discovered independently 70 years later by people running a television appeal in Maastricht. Relate, do not identify. It is worth putting a little more of the Dutch work on the table, because the numbers are what made the field take it seriously. When Rom and Escher followed up their television appeal, they were able to work with a substantial group of voice hearers, and roughly a third of them had never been patients of any psychiatric service. Not lapsed patients. Never patients. They then did something obvious that nobody had done, which was to ask the coping group how they coped, and to write it down as a set of strategies rather than as symptoms. The strategies that came back were mundane and practical. Setting times. Some people would tell the voices explicitly that they were busy and would attend to them later in the day, and reported that this worked. Selective listening, taking some of what was said seriously and declining the rest, structuring the day so that the empty hours when the voices were worst were smaller, talking to at least one other person who knew and did not panic. Look at that list. A fixed time, selective attention, structure in the day. One other person who knows. There is no medication in it, no technique with a name, and nothing anybody would call a treatment. It is the same short list that turns up whenever you look at people managing something difficult over decades. And it is, almost item for item, what a Swiss psychiatrist arrived at on his own in 1914 with no data at all. The Hearing Voices movement grew out of that work and now exists in dozens of countries. It is not without its critics, and some of its stronger claims are contested. But the central observation has held up and has changed practice. The goal of getting a person to stop hearing a voice, which mostly does not work, can be replaced with the goal of changing what the voice is to them, which often does. Chapter 23. The Continuum. The Dutch work was small and unusual and easy to dismiss. What made it stick was the epidemiology that followed. Through the 1990s and 2000s, a series of large general population surveys asked ordinary people at scale whether they had ever had experiences of certain kinds. Hearing a voice when nobody was there, feeling that something had been communicated to them specifically, having a conviction that turned out not to be shared by anybody else. The reviews of that literature, of which the best known is by Louise Johns and Jim Van Os in 2001, converge on a picture that is still not widely known outside the field. Experiences of this type are reported by a substantial minority of the general population at rates many times higher than the rate of any diagnosis they are associated with. Most of the people reporting them have no disorder, are not distressed by them, and never come into contact with any service. The conclusion the field drew is called the continuum model. These experiences are not a separate country that some people live in and others do not. They are the far end of an ordinary distribution that everybody is on. Two cautions, because this finding is very often stretched. The first is that this does not mean diagnoses are meaningless or that serious mental illness is a myth. It is not. It is real, it is disabling, and people who have it need care. The continuum model does not say there is no difference. It says the difference is not the presence of the experience. The second is that a chunk of what predicts whether one of these experiences becomes a disorder is not the experience at all. It is distress and the loss of the ability to function, and whether the person can hold the experience alongside an ordinary life. Those are the hinges. Which brings us back to a man who had 5 children, a full practice, and a house he had to be in for dinner, and who said explicitly that this was what saved him. It is worth being precise about what the continuum model does and does not license, because It is one of the most misused findings in popular psychology, and I would rather you had the careful version. It does not say that everybody is a bit psychotic. That is a slogan, and it is wrong. It does not say that diagnosis is arbitrary, that severe mental illness is a social construction, or that people in acute distress do not need treatment. They do, it works, and delay makes outcomes worse. What it says is narrower and more interesting, that the presence of an unusual experience is a poor discriminator, because unusual experiences are common in people who are perfectly well, which relocates the question. If the experience is not the thing that separates illness from health, what is? The literature's answer is consistent across a lot of studies, and it comes down to three things. Distress, whether the experience is frightening or merely odd. Function, whether it is interfering with work, relationships, eating, sleeping, and the ordinary running of a life. And conviction, whether the person can hold it alongside other explanations or whether it has become the single unquestionable account of what is happening. Those three, not the experience itself. That is the line, and it is a much more usable line than the one most people are carrying, which is simply, did something strange happen to me, and does that mean something is wrong? Chapter 24. It matters where you grew up. There is one more finding here, and it is my favorite in the entire literature, because it is so unexpected and so clean. In 2015, the anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann and colleagues published a comparative study. They interviewed people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia who heard voices in 3 places: San Diego, in the United States, Accra, in Ghana, and Chennai, in India. 20 in each site, interviewed carefully and at length. The Americans overwhelmingly described their voices as an intrusion. They used the language of violence and of assault. They described being told to hurt people. They did not, on the whole, know who the voices were. They described the experience as a bombardment by something alien. In Chennai, many described the voices as relatives, family members living and dead. The content was often domestic and frequently mundane to the point of comedy. Instructions about cooking, about bathing, about household tasks. A number found them irritating rather than terrifying. In Accra, a majority described the voices as coming from God, and although many also reported bad voices, a substantial number described the overall experience as fundamentally positive. The clinical facts were the same in all 3 places. The experience of them was not. Luhrmann's interpretation, stated carefully, is that culture supplies the interpretive frame, and that the frame changes not just how the experience is described afterwards, but the character of the experience itself. Now hold that against the man in Zurich in 1913. He had, ready to hand, an enormous frame. He had a training in mythology, a reading of Gnostic and alchemical literature, and a professional theory in progress. When something came up out of him, he had somewhere to put it that was not, "I am ill." He was, in the most literal sense, culturally equipped for it. almost nobody in a modern Western country is. Our only available frame for an unbidden voice is the medical one, and the medical one comes with a threat attached. That is not an argument against medicine. It is an observation that the frame does work, and that if the only frame you own is a frightening one, the experience will be frightening. There is a corollary of the framing finding that is more directly useful, and it does not require any unusual experience at all. If the interpretive frame changes the character of the experience, then the frames you personally have available are doing real work on your nights, and you have some say over what is in that set. Most people in a modern Western country have exactly 2 frames for anything the mind does uninvited. It is a symptom, or it is nothing, and I should stop being self-indulgent. Those are both bad. The first is frightening and mostly wrong. The second is dismissive and produces the specific loneliness of not being able to mention it. And there are others available that are neither medical nor dismissive, and that are perfectly compatible with a completely secular view of the world. That it is old material being retrieved without supervision. That it is the same machinery that writes your dreams running with the door open. That it is a mind with nothing coming in, doing what minds do when nothing is coming in. None of those is a comfort exactly. All of them are less frightening than symptom and less lonely than nothing, and all of them are, as far as the evidence goes, more accurate than either. You are not choosing what your mind produces at this hour. You have a surprising amount of say over which of those sentences you meet it with. Chapter 25. Was he ill? Now we deal with the question directly, and then we put it down. There have been essentially 4 attempts to describe the 1913 to 1919 period in diagnostic language. That it was a psychotic episode, that it was a severe depressive or dissociative episode, that it was a form of what would now be called a personality disturbance, and that it was, as Ellenberger argued, a creative illness that is not a clinical category at all. I decline all 4, on 3 stated grounds. And I want you to hear the grounds rather than the conclusion, because the grounds are what you can use. The first ground is that we have no informant. Every account of his internal state during those years comes from him. At the time, in the black notebooks, in a stylized literary form in the Red Book, and in old age through Aniela Jaffe. There is no independent observer's record of what he was like across those years. His family said very little publicly. His colleagues saw him at work where he functioned. The second ground is that we have no ordinary Tuesdays. What survives is the material he chose to record, and he was recording precisely the extraordinary. Nobody writes down the afternoons on which nothing happened. So the record over-represents intensity by construction, and reading it is like judging a man's marriage from his arguments. The third ground is that the evidence is curated by people with positions. His admirers had reasons to present a heroic dissent. His critics, including some very serious ones, had reasons to present a breakdown dressed up as a discovery. And Jung himself in old age was constructing a legacy which every one of us would do. So, we do not know, we cannot know, and a diagnosis assembled at this distance from evidence of that shape would tell you more about the diagnostician than the patient. And now, the turn, which is the reason this chapter exists at all. At 1 a.m, your mind performs the same procedure on you. It assembles a case, it selects the evidence, it draws exclusively on the times things went badly, because those are the ones that are stored with the most detail. It ignores every ordinary Tuesday on which you were fine, because nothing happened on those and nothing was filed. And it produces a confident verdict about the whole of your character, from a curated file with no informant and no ordinary Tuesdays. If you would not accept that standard of evidence about a man who has been dead for 60 years, you are under no obligation to accept it about yourself at 1 a.m. And there is one more reason to decline the question, which is that answering it would not actually get us anything. Suppose we could settle it. Suppose a definitive answer arrived tomorrow, with a name and a diagnostic code attached, agreed by everybody. What would change? The account would still be what it is. The method he built would still work or not work on its own merits, and it does appear to work, and it was arrived at by an ill man or a well one, and either way, the mechanism is the mechanism. The research from Maastricht would still say what it says. The continuum studies would still say what they say. The finding about concrete and abstract thinking, which is the practically important thing in this whole evening, was established with control groups and has nothing to do with him at all. So the diagnosis would be a label on a dead man, and it would not adjust a single thing you might do tonight. I labor this because the question is a trap of a particular kind. It presents itself as the important question. It feels like the thing that has to be settled before anything else can proceed. And a great many of the questions that keep people awake are exactly that shape, enormously compelling, apparently foundational, and completely inert. Nothing follows from the answer. You could have it and be no further forward. It is worth learning to recognize them, because they are the ones that will happily take 3 hours. Chapter 26. Characters who will not obey, and what everybody does at night. Here is a piece of research that has nothing to do with psychiatry and is, I think, the most reassuring thing in tonight's second half. In 2003, the psychologist Marjorie Taylor and her colleagues published a study of professional fiction writers. Taylor had spent her career studying imaginary companions in children and had established that they are common, normal, and associated with no deficit whatsoever. She wondered what happened to that capacity in adults who use it for a living. So she interviewed 50 published novelists. And what she found is that a large majority of them reported experiencing their characters as having a degree of independent agency. Characters who refused to do what the plot required. Characters who said things the author had not planned. Characters who argued with them. Several described the experience of writing dialogue as closer to transcription than composition. Some reported characters showing up outside working hours. Taylor called it the illusion of independent agency, and the word illusion is doing careful work there. Nobody in the sample believed their characters were real people. They knew perfectly well what they were. They simply reported that the experience of producing them did not feel like producing them. And these were not distressed people. They were working professionals of average or better mental health, doing their jobs. Set that beside Philemon. A man sat in a room and encountered a figure who told him things he had not thought and disagreed with him. Roughly 100 years later, researchers interviewed 50 novelists and found most of them describing exactly the same experience as an ordinary feature of their working week. The capacity to produce an apparently autonomous other person inside your own head is not rare, not pathological, and in at least one profession is a job requirement. Let me broaden it one more step before we get to the useful part. You already do the thing we have spent 2 hours discussing every single night, and you have never once been alarmed by it. In a dream, your mind generates an environment you did not design, populated by people you did not invent, saying things you could not have predicted inside a plot you are not steering, and it presents all of this to you with such conviction that you believe it completely while it is running. That is a far more extreme production than anything Jung reported. He was awake and knew where he was. In a dream, you do not even retain that. And every human being does it every night for roughly 2 hours in total, from before birth until death. Nobody thinks this is a symptom, for the single reason that it happens after you lose consciousness. And consciousness is where we have located the border of the self. But the machinery does not switch on at the border. It is running all the time. Sleep merely removes the thing that was drowning it out, which is exactly what happens, partially and briefly, at 1 in the morning when you are lying in the dark with your eyes shut and nothing coming in. You have not become unwell. You have got quiet enough to hear the equipment that has been running the whole time. Chapter 27. 2 kinds of going over things. Now we come to the finding that I think is worth the whole evening, and it did not come from anybody studying visions. It came from people studying depression. For a long time, the research on repetitive thinking was straightforward and gloomy. Rumination is bad for you. Going over things is associated with depression, with anxiety, with poorer recovery. Stop doing it. The trouble was that the same research kept turning up an inconvenience. Some kinds of going over things are clearly good for you. Reflection helps, working through a problem helps. Grieving properly requires returning to something repeatedly. Planning is repetitive thought. So is preparing for a difficult conversation. So the field had a puzzle. The same broad activity, dwelling on something, sometimes helps enormously and sometimes destroys people, and for years nobody could say what the difference was. In 2008, the psychologist Edward Watkins published a review in Psychological Bulletin that pulled the whole literature together and answered it. The difference is not the amount, it is not the duration, it is not, mostly, even the subject matter. 2 people can spend the same 40 minutes on the same event, and one of them comes out lighter and one of them comes out worse. The difference is the level of construal, which is a technical phrase for a very simple thing. Concrete thinking helps. Abstract thinking harms. That is the finding. The rest of this evening is what it means. It is worth saying how the field arrived there, because the history explains why nobody told you this. For a long time, the research treated rumination as a single thing and asked how much of it people did. The finding, repeated many times, was that more of it went with worse outcomes, particularly for depression, and the practical advice that followed was simply do less of it. That advice does not work, and everybody who has been given it knows that it does not work, because you cannot stop by deciding to, and being told to stop adds a layer of failure to the original problem. Worse, it was visibly incomplete, because the same broad activity clearly helps in some forms. Planning is repetitive thought about a problem. So is preparing for a difficult conversation, and rehearsing a piece of music, and working out what went wrong with something so that it goes better next time. Grief requires returning to the same material repeatedly and cannot be done any other way. So the field had a genuine puzzle. The same activity, sometimes healing and sometimes destroying, with no way to tell them apart from the outside and no way to tell them apart from the inside either. The resolution, when it came, was not a new therapy or a new drug. It was a reclassification. Somebody stopped asking how much and started asking what kind, and the whole literature reorganized around the answer. That is often how these things go, and it is worth knowing, because it means the reason nobody has been able to help you with this may not be that your case is unusual. It may be that they were measuring the wrong variable. It is worth putting the two side by side in the plainest possible terms, because the distinction is the practical payload of the whole evening, and I would like it to survive the night. Concrete thinking is about a thing that happened. Abstract thinking is about what kind of person you are. That is it. That is the entire distinction, stripped of the technical vocabulary. And you can hear which one you are in without any training, because they sound completely different in the head. Concrete has nouns and times in it. Thursday, the kitchen. What he said after I mentioned the money. The look on her face. The number on the statement. Abstract has categories and always and never in it. I always do this. I am the sort of person who. Why can I never? This is who I am now. Now, the thing that makes this hard is that abstract thinking feels more intelligent. It feels like getting to the bottom of it. Concrete thinking feels trivial, like fussing about details when the real question is enormous. That intuition is exactly backwards, and it is why so many thoughtful people are so bad at this. The more reflective you are, the faster you climb, and the faster you climb, the sooner you arrive somewhere with no flaw. There is one more property of the abstract mode that is worth knowing, because it explains the duration. Abstract statements cannot be tested, so they cannot be closed. If the thought is that you handled Thursday badly, there is a fact of the matter, and it will either survive examination or it will not, and either way, you are finished with it. If the thought is that you are fundamentally a person who ruins things, no possible evidence settles it. Every counterexample gets absorbed as an exception. Every confirmation gets counted. The question has no answer, not because it is deep, but because it is malformed. A mind presented with a malformed question does not stop. It keeps trying, because trying is what it does, and there is no signal that would tell it to stand down. That is why 3 a.m. can take 3 hours. Not because the problem is large, because you have phrased it in a way that has no exit, and then set a very persistent machine to work on it. Chapter 28. Concrete and abstract. Let me make it specific, because the words concrete and abstract are almost useless until you see them side by side. Concrete thinking is about the particulars of an event. What actually happened? Who said what? In what order? What the room looked like? What you did next? What specifically you might do differently? It stays at the level of process and detail and mechanics. Abstract thinking moves up a level. It is about meaning, cause, and category. What this says about you, why you are like this, what kind of person does that, what it all means, why this always happens to you. Now, take one event and run it both ways. Concrete. I said the wrong thing at 4 o'clock after he mentioned the deadline when I was already tired. I could have said nothing and waited. Next time, I will wait. Abstract. Why do I always do this? What is wrong with me? Why can I never keep my mouth shut? What does that say about me? Same event. Same 40 minutes. The first one ends because it is about a specific thing and specific things run out. The second one cannot end because it is a question about your whole nature and there is no fact that could answer it. That is why 1 a.m. is so long. Not because the problem is large, because it has been phrased at a level of abstraction where no answer exists, so the mind keeps going round looking for one. Watkins's review and the experimental work that followed it shows this can be manipulated. Train people to describe a distressing event concretely, and their mood and their problem-solving improve. Push them into the abstract mode and both get worse. It is not a personality trait. It is a mode, and modes can be switched. The experiments that establish this are worth describing, because when you hear how they are done, the finding stops being a slogan and becomes something you can feel. The basic design is a mood induction followed by a manipulation. You bring people into a laboratory, put them into a low mood by a standard method, and then give them a set of prompts to think with. One group gets prompts pitched at the level of detail and process. How did it happen? What were the specific steps? What did you notice? What happened next? The other group gets prompts pitched at meaning and cause. Why did it happen? What does it mean about you? What are the implications? Same event, same amount of thinking. The only difference is the altitude of the questions. The concrete group comes out with better mood and, in the versions that test it, better subsequent problem-solving on unrelated tasks. The abstract group comes out worse on both. This has been run in variations many times. on non-clinical samples, and on people with a history of depression. And in the depressed samples, the effect is generally larger, not smaller. Then there is the training version, which is the one that matters practically. People are given repeated practice in the concrete mode across sessions on their own real material until it becomes the default. In several trials that produces reductions in depressive symptoms, and it has been taken far enough to be delivered as a standalone intervention. I want to be careful about the size of the claim. This is not a cure. The trials are modest. And like most of psychology, this area has had to become more careful about what replicates. Nobody is claiming that asking yourself a different question will fix a serious depression. But the direction is consistent, the mechanism is specific, and unlike almost everything else in this field, it is something you can apply at 1 a.m. without equipment, without a therapist, and without waiting for an appointment. Chapter 29. The word that traps you and what he was already doing. There is a single word that reliably drops a person into the abstract mode at 1 a.m, and once you have noticed it, you will hear it every time. Why? Why did I do that? Why am I like this? Why does this keep happening? Why did they say that? Why is a request for a cause, and causes about your own character are not available to you, and never will be, because you are inside the thing you are asking about. So the question runs and never returns a value. The replacement is not stop thinking about it. That does not work, and it is faintly insulting to be told. The replacement is a change of question word. What, where, when, what exactly happened? What did I actually do? What is the next actual thing? Those questions have answers. Answers terminate. A question that can be answered is a question that ends, and ending is the entire mechanism you are lying there without. I'm aware how small this sounds at 2 a.m. It is small. It is also the difference the measurements keep finding, over and over, in study after study, and it costs nothing to try. Now go back to a man sitting at a desk in Kusnacht in 1914 and look at what he actually did with the images. He did not ask why they were happening to him. That is the question you or I would have asked, and it would have run all night, and it would have gone nowhere, because there was no answer available to him in 1914. He asked what? What is this? What does it look like? What color is the water? Who is standing there? What does he say? What do I say back? What does the room look like? Now let me write it down. Now let me draw it. Now let me paint it and get the shape of the wings right. Every single one of those is a concrete question about the particulars of an experience. Every one of them terminates. And when it terminated, there was an object on a page, and he could go to bed. He did not have a theory of construal. Watkins was born decades after this. He had a working psychiatrist's instinct that emotion which stays emotion goes round forever, and that emotion which is made into an image stops. He arrived at the finding by hand, in the dark, in the worst years of his life, and then a body of research arrived at the same place 90 years later with a control group. That convergence is the most persuasive thing in this whole story, and it is much more useful than the temple in the rock. There is a small refinement worth adding, because the instruction to avoid why can be taken too literally, and then it stops working. Why is not a forbidden word. It is an excellent word in daylight applied to systems, machines, organizations, other people's decisions, and historical events. It becomes a trap only in one specific configuration, when it is pointed at your own character, at night, by you. Why did the engine fail is answerable. Why did the meeting go badly is answerable. Why am I like this is not, and it is not a matter of insufficient effort. The information required to answer it does not exist in a form you can reach, because you are the instrument doing the measuring and the object being measured. So the practical rule is narrower than never ask why. It is notice when the subject of the question has become your own nature, and swap the question word. Not why am I like this, but what did I actually do and when, and what is the next actual thing. And if you want a single test for whether you are in the trap, it is this. Ask yourself what a satisfactory answer would look like. If you can describe one, you are fine. If you cannot even specify what would count as an answer, you are not thinking, you are circling. And the circling will continue for as long as you leave it running. Chapter 30. Standing slightly further away. There is a second body of work that arrives at the same door from another direction, and it is worth 10 minutes, because the intervention is almost absurdly small. Ethan Kross and Özlem Ayduk have spent years on what they call self-distancing. The setup is straightforward. Take people. Have them recall a genuinely distressing experience, and vary one thing, whether they go over it from inside their own eyes, as themselves, in the first person, or from a slight distance, as an observer watching the scene. The distance condition consistently produces less emotional reactivity, lower physiological arousal, and, on follow-up, less recurrence of the distress. And the mechanism the researchers identify is exactly the one we have been discussing. The distance group spontaneously reconstrues the event rather than reliving it. They start explaining what happened. The immersed group starts re-feeling it. There is a related and even smaller finding on the language you use with yourself. Addressing yourself by name, or as you rather than I, during a difficult moment, produces measurable reductions in distress and better performance under stress compared with first-person self-talk. It sounds ridiculous. It measures. I will not oversell it. The effects are modest. This is a young literature, and nothing here is a treatment for anything. But look at the shape of it, and then look at Philemon, an old man with a white beard and kingfisher wings, who is emphatically not you standing in the room saying the thing. Jung got the distance by building a whole person out of it and giving him a name. That is the extreme version. The ordinary version, available to you tonight, is smaller. It is the difference between the sentence, "You have wasted your life," arriving from nowhere with the authority of the truth, and the sentence, "There is a voice in here at 1 in the morning saying, I have wasted my life." The second one is the same content in a room with two things in it, you and it. There is a version of this you can use tonight that requires no technique and no notebook, and it is the smallest thing in the whole evening. If a sentence arrives about you in the flat, certain voice, try adding 4 words to the front of it. There is a voice saying, there is a voice saying, you have wasted your life. There is a voice saying, nobody would notice. There is a voice saying, it is too late now. Nothing about the content has changed. You have not argued with it, and you have not pretended it is false, which is important because arguing wakes you up and pretending does not work. What has changed is the number of objects in the room. A moment ago there was one thing, the truth about you, arriving. Now there are 2, a voice and somebody listening to it. That is the entire maneuver. It sounds too small to do anything, and it is the thing the measurements keep finding. He did the enormous version. He built the voice a body, gave it horns and kingfisher wings, painted it over several days, gave it a name out of a Greek poem, and argued with it for 6 years. You do not need to paint anything. You need the 4 words, and you need to notice, afterwards, that the sentence lost some of its authority the moment it acquired a speaker. Chapter 31. What writing it down actually does. I want to handle this carefully, because writing things down is one of the most over-promised interventions in popular psychology, and the honest version is smaller and more interesting than the version you will have heard. Here is what the evidence supports. Putting an experience into language in a structured form over several sessions produces measurable benefits for some people some of the time. The effects are real and they are not large. They tend to appear more in physical and functional measures than in mood. Here is the part that matters for tonight, and it is the finding people never quote. The benefit does not come from venting. Studies that compared people who simply expressed emotion with people who built a coherent account found the benefit tracking the account, not the expression. What predicts improvement is a change in the structure of the story between the first session and the last. The emergence of causal language, of ordering, of a narrative that has parts. In other words, it is not getting it out, it is making it into something with a shape. Which is the same finding as the last 2 chapters wearing different clothes. An emotion that has been given edges, sequence, and specifics stops circulating. An emotion that has merely been felt harder does not. And it explains a detail of the Red Book that would otherwise be a curiosity. He did not just write the material down, he wrote it out in careful calligraphy and then went back over it and added a commentary explaining it to himself and then painted it. Every one of those passes is another act of giving the thing a structure. He did it 4 times. Nobody needs to do it 4 times. But it tells you what kind of activity was doing the work, and it was not confession. There is a practical shape to this that is worth having, because writing things down is one of those interventions people attempt badly, get nothing from, and conclude does not work. The version that does nothing is the one most people try. You are upset, so you write down that you are upset at length in the same voice the upset is speaking in. That is transcription of a feeling, and the evidence for it is poor, and it can leave people feeling worse because they have spent 40 minutes rehearsing the thing. The version with support behind it looks different in 3 specific ways. It is concrete. What happened, in what order, who said what you did next, nouns and verbs, not adjectives, about your character. It is repeated. The benefit in the studies shows up across sessions, not in one, and the interesting finding is that what changes between the first session and the last is the structure of the account rather than the intensity of the feeling. And it has an end, a fixed length or a fixed time after which you stop whether or not it feels finished, because an exercise with no terminating condition is just the original problem with a pen in it. None of that requires you to be a writer, and none of it requires anybody to read it. He wrote his in notebooks that were not published for 107 years. Chapter 32, The Daily Object, and 16 years. Let me put the practical version of all this in one place, because I want you to leave with something you could do rather than something you have understood. It has 3 parts, and none of them is difficult. The first is a fixed time that is not 1 in the morning. The reason Jung's method worked is that he went to the material at a time of his choosing, at a desk, awake. Ambush is what makes a thought unbearable. Appointment is what makes it survivable. If there is something that comes for you at night, the move is not to fight it at night. It is to have somewhere in the day where it is allowed to be dealt with, and to be able to say, at 1 in the morning, not now, we do this at 11. The second is a physical trace. Cheap notebook, bad handwriting, nobody reading it, concrete language, what happened, in what order, what I did, what is next, not why, never why. The third is the daily thing with your hands. He built a village out of stones for months because he could not think of anything better, and he was right that he could not think of anything better, because thinking was not what was needed. Something small, made, daily, with no purpose and no audience. He drew a circle every morning at Château d'Aux. It does not matter what it is. That is it. Fixed time, physical trace, daily object. There is no vision in that list. There does not need to be. I want to say something about the time scale, because I think it is where most people go wrong with a story like this, and where most self-improvement material lies to you. He worked on that book for around 16 years, not a weekend, not a course, not 30 days. 16 years of slow, unpaid, unfinished, unwitnessed work on an object he never completed, during which he also raised 5 children, ran a practice, wrote other books entirely, and got older. And the crisis did not end when he finished the book, because he never finished the book. It ended somewhere in the middle, quietly, without a moment, in a way he could only see afterwards. That is what recovery from a genuinely difficult period actually looks like from inside. There is no scene where it lifts. There is a Tuesday, some years in, on which you notice that the thing which used to take the whole night now takes 20 minutes, and you cannot say when that changed. If you are in something at the moment and waiting for the moment when it breaks, I would gently suggest that you may be waiting for a thing that does not exist, and that its non-existence is not bad news. The alternative is better. The alternative is that it goes quietly in the background while you are busy doing something with your hands. There is a specific reason the physical thing matters, and it is not mystical. An activity that occupies your hands and a small amount of your attention does something that no amount of resolve can do. It takes the equipment offline that produces the abstract mode. Abstraction requires a certain kind of free-running attention. Give the same attention a concrete task with a bit of friction in it, and it cannot climb, because it is busy with where this stone goes. And here is the part that is easy to miss. The material does not stop, it keeps arriving. But it arrives in the concrete mode because the mode you are already in shapes what comes. That is why people solve things while walking, and why the thought that would not come at the desk arrives in the shower. It is not that the mind has been freed, it is that it has been prevented from going upstairs. One further note about the time scale, because it is where most people quit. The stone village went on for months before anything came of it. The notebooks ran for years. The folio took 16. Nothing in that period had a visible return. There was no week in which he could have told you it was working. If he had been asked at any point in 1914 whether this was helping, the honest answer would have been that he did not know, and that he was doing it because he could not think of anything else. That is the ordinary shape of it, and it is worth being warned, because the modern expectation is that an intervention either works within a fortnight or is the wrong intervention. Some things do work in a fortnight. This kind does not. What it does instead is accumulate invisibly, and then at some point a long way down the line you notice that a thing which used to take the whole night now takes 20 minutes, and you cannot say when that changed. Chapter 33. The unfinished sentence and what it was actually for. The last page of calligraphy in the Red Book stops in the middle of a sentence. He never went back. He lived another 31 years after he put it down. He wrote a shelf of other books. He was asked about it, and he said, in effect, that he could not finish it, and left it there. There is a temptation to make that tragic. I do not think it is. A book that stops mid-sentence because the man writing it no longer needed to write it is not a failure. It is the most honest possible ending. He did not resolve the material. He outgrew the need to keep resolving it. And there is something in that for the way you might hold your own unfinished things. Not every project that stops was abandoned. Some of them were completed by the person changing until the project was no longer necessary, which does not look like completion from outside and is indistinguishable from it in effect. The sentence is still there, in the facsimile, breaking off. He signed nothing. He drew a line under nothing. He just stopped and went to work on something else, and was, by every account, well. So what was the Red Book in the end? Not a grimoire, not a prophecy, not a secret teaching, and not the record of a breakdown. It was somewhere to put things. That is the whole of it, and it is not a small thing, because the single hardest problem with a mind in difficulty is that everything it produces has nowhere to go. It comes up, it circulates, it comes up again, and because there is no container, it has to be carried continuously by the person it is happening to. He built a container. He made it beautiful, which was probably not necessary, but was clearly good for him. He put things in it for 16 years, and the material stopped needing to be carried because it was in the book. Everything the research says supports the same shape. Concrete beats abstract. Structure beats venting. Distance beats immersion. A named figure beats a nameless verdict. An object with edges beats a feeling without any. All of those are the same instruction in different languages, and the instruction is not understand it. The instruction is put it somewhere. There is one more thing about that object, and then we will start going down. He was not qualified to make it. He was a psychiatrist who had taught himself a script that had been out of ordinary use for 400 years, and who painted like a gifted amateur, which is what he was. Somebody trained would have done it better and faster and with fewer mistakes, and it would not have helped him more, possibly less, because the thing that was doing the work was not the quality of the object, it was the hours. It was sitting down after the patients had gone, night after night, and doing something slow and absorbing and physical with material that would otherwise have been circulating in his head. A professional would have needed fewer hours to make a better book. He needed the hours. The book was the excuse for them. I would like you to take that, if you take one thing, because it removes the only real obstacle. Whatever you might make, you will not be good at it. That is true of everybody at the beginning and true of most people permanently. And it has almost no bearing on whether it does for you what this did for him. An amateur's hours are exactly as long as a master's. That is the whole of it. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands be heavy. There is one more small thing about the abandoned book, and then we will begin going down properly. He did not tidy it. He could have gone back at any point in 31 years and finished the sentence, or added a closing page, or written a note explaining why he had stopped. He was a productive writer with a large output. It would have cost him an afternoon. He left it as it was, broken off mid-line, with the ink stopping where his attention had stopped. There is something in that I have come to like very much. A great deal of the exhaustion people carry is the work of tidying, going back over things that are finished with in order to give them an ending that satisfies. Almost none of it needs an ending. Most of what is over is simply over in the middle of a sentence on an ordinary day, and the sentence is not waiting to be completed, it is just where you stopped. Chapter 34. What this evening is not saying, before we close the necessary chapter, and I would rather say it clearly than gently. Nothing tonight is a suggestion that you should go looking for this. Jung was not seeking an experience. He was already having one and decided how to meet it, which is a completely different situation, and he was a trained psychiatrist doing it inside a structure of a house, a family, colleagues, and a job. And nothing tonight says that everything a mind produces is fine. There are conditions under which what we have discussed does not apply, and they are recognizable. If what is happening is frightening you rather than unsettling you, if it does not stop when the situation changes, if it is telling you to do things, if it is making it hard to work, or to be with people, or to look after yourself, if other people who know you have started to say something, if you are losing sleep for many nights rather than one, if there is any thought of harming yourself, under any of those, the correct next move is not a notebook, it is a doctor in daylight this week. That is not a failure, and it is not an admission of anything. It is the same move Jung would have made about a patient in an afternoon. The material tonight is for the ordinary version, the 3 in the morning version that arrives and circles and goes when the light comes. For the other one, there are people whose entire job is this, and they are considerably better at it than a notebook. Let me also say what this evening is not saying about the material itself, because there is an over-reading available and it is popular. I have not claimed that what came up out of him was true or wise or from anywhere other than him. The figures he met said things he found valuable. They also said things that were wrong and things that were merely strange, and a great deal that was neither, and he was clear about that at the time. He argued with them precisely because he did not regard them as authorities. The unconscious, whatever we take that word to mean, is not a wise elder. It is not looking after you. It has no plan for your life. It produces material, and some of the material is useful, and quite a lot of it is repetitive, self-serving, decades out of date, and occasionally cruel. That is worth saying at 1 in the morning specifically, because at this hour the material arrives with tremendous authority, and there is a temptation, if you have absorbed a certain amount of writing about the deep self, to treat that authority as credentials. It is not credentials, it is a production value. The correct relationship to what your mind hands you at this hour is the one he modeled. Take it seriously enough to write it down, and not so seriously that you do what it says. There is a last distinction I want to draw before we go down, and it is the one that matters most for anybody who recognizes themselves in tonight. Being interested in your own mind is not the same as being unwell. A proportion of the people listening to a recording like this are the sort of person who notices what is happening inside them, in detail, and has always done so, and has occasionally wondered whether the noticing is itself a symptom. It is not. It is a trait. It is called something dull in the literature. It correlates with creative work and with openness and with a certain amount of unnecessary suffering. And it is not a disorder in any sense. What it does do is put you closer to material that other people are insulated from, which means you will encounter more of this than the average person, and you will have to develop a relationship with it that the average person never needs. That is the actual situation, and it is worth naming, because the two available stories are both wrong. You are not fine and imagining it, and you are not ill. You are a person with the volume turned up, who needs somewhere to put things, and who has to build that for himself because nobody hands it to you. Which is exactly what he did. In a house, on a lake, in 1914, without any idea whether it was going to work. Chapter 35. The last thing about the man, and somewhere quieter. He died in June 1961 at 85. At the house at Kusnacht that he had built in 1908, in the room he had worked in for 50 years. He had, by then, a body of work, a following, and a reputation that will be argued about for as long as anybody argues about this subject. Some of the arguments are serious, and some of what he wrote does not survive them. But the thing I would leave you with is smaller and more human than any of that. For 6 years he was frightened that his own mind was going to take him away from his life. He did not know it would be all right. Nobody told him it would be all right. He had, from his own professional experience, considerable evidence that it would not be. And what he did with that was to go down to the shore after lunch and build a village out of stones, and sit at his desk after the children were in bed and write down what he saw and get up in the morning and see patients. He was not brave in the way stories are usually brave. He was frightened for 6 years and kept a routine. That is available to you. Not the visions, not the book, the routine, kept while frightened. We are nearly at the end, and it is worth putting the whole evening into one shape before you go. Your mind will produce things you did not author. It has done this every night of your life. It is doing it now, more visibly than usual, because it is dark and quiet, and there is nothing coming in. That is not a sign of anything wrong with you. What determines whether it costs you the night is not the content. It is 3 things, all of which are small and all of which are yours. Whether you meet it at a time of your choosing or only when it ambushes you. Whether you keep it concrete, in particulars, in what and where and when, or let it climb into the abstract where no answer exists. And whether you can put a small distance between yourself and it, so that there are 2 things in the room rather than one. A man in Switzerland in 1913 worked all 3 of those out on his own, in the dark, by hand, over 6 years, and made an extremely beautiful object in the process. You do not need the object. You need a place to put the thing down. One last note about him, and then we are done with the man. He got old. That is the part that never makes it into the retellings, and it is the part I find most reassuring. The 6 years ended somewhere around 1919, and he lived until 1961, and the overwhelming majority of that life was ordinary professional work. Seminars, patients, papers, arguments with colleagues, books that are of variable quality, a garden, grandchildren, a boat on the lake. The extraordinary period occupies 6 years out of 85. We tell it as though it were the whole of him because it makes the better story, and because the object that came out of it is beautiful. and because a life is easier to hold if it has a crisis and a resolution in it. But the actual proportions are these: a few years that were very hard and very strange, and then 6 decades of a man going to work. If you are currently in a period that has taken over the whole of how you think about your life, that proportion is worth holding on to. The thing you are inside now will, with a bit of luck and some time, end up as a chapter in something much longer and much duller, and the duller part is not the anticlimax. The duller part is the life. The crisis is just the part that is easy to tell. And one last practical note, which belongs here rather than earlier, because it is the sort of thing that is only bearable once the argument is over. If you take nothing else from tonight, take the appointment. Not the notebook, not the drawing, not the figure with a name. Those all help, and they are all optional. The appointment is not optional, because it is the piece that makes all the others possible. A fixed time, in daylight, at which the thing is allowed to be dealt with. 20 minutes. The same 20 minutes each day, if you can manage it, and if you cannot, then whichever 20 you can. Its function is not the thinking that happens in it. Its function is that it gives you something true to say at 1 in the morning. Not now. We do this at 11. That sentence only works if it is true, which is why the appointment has to be real and has to be kept. But when it is true, it is the only thing I know of that reliably ends the argument at this hour, because it is not an argument. It is a scheduling decision, and the part of you that is awake and frightened has no counter to a scheduling decision. Chapter 36. Let it be tomorrow's. So let us put the whole of it in one place, quietly, and then stop. Your mind will produce things you did not author. It did it last night, and it will do it tomorrow, and it has been doing it every night since before you can remember, mostly behind a door marked sleep where nobody thinks to object. Tonight the door is a little open. That is all that has happened. 3 things decide whether that costs you the night, and all 3 are small, and all 3 are yours, whether you meet it at a time you chose or only when it comes for you, whether you keep it concrete, in the specifics, in what and where and when, or let it climb up into the abstract where there is no answer and therefore no ending, and whether there are 2 things in the room or 1. A man in a house on a lake worked all 3 of those out on his own, in the dark, by hand, over 6 years, and made an extraordinarily beautiful object on the way, and then abandoned it mid-sentence, because he no longer needed it, and went back to work. You do not need the object. Let your shoulders drop, let the weight of you settle into whatever you are lying on. Whatever came up during this, and whatever comes up in the hour after it ends, does not have to be dealt with now. That is the only genuinely false belief operating at this hour, that because it is here, it has to be handled here. It does not. It has waited this long. It will still be there at 11, when you are upright and dressed and have had something to drink, and are in possession of the part of your mind that evaluates, and not only the part that produces. Put it down on the floor beside the bed, not resolved, not understood, not forgiven. just down. He built a small village out of stones because he could not think of anything better to do, and it turned out that having nothing better and doing something small anyway is not a failure of method. It is the method. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. One more time, and then I will stop talking. He was frightened for 6 years. He did not know it would be all right. Nobody told him it would be all right, and he had, from his own working life, a great deal of evidence that it would not be. And what he did with that was to go down to the water after lunch and put stones on top of each other and sit at his desk after the children were asleep and write down what he saw and get up in the morning and see patients. That is the whole of it. There is no other secret in the story. He was not brave in the way stories are usually brave. He was frightened for a long time and kept a routine. That is available to you tonight and tomorrow, and it does not require you to feel any differently than you feel at this moment. It does not ask you to be less afraid first. It asks only that the small thing gets done anyway, at roughly the same hour, whether or not the fear has lifted. And in a year, or in 2, if somebody asks you how you got through it, you will find that you have no interesting answer. You will say something about a walk, or a notebook, or a job you had to turn up to. It will sound like nothing. It will sound so much like nothing that you may be slightly embarrassed to say it. That is what getting through it sounds like from the inside afterwards. It is not a story, it is a list of very small things done repeatedly by somebody who was not sure they were working. The stones are still in the water at the edge of that lake, presumably, scattered by a century of weather, indistinguishable now from any other stones. And the man who put them there was fine. For another 42 years, he was fine. There is nothing further to work out tonight. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of you go. Sleep now.